The wind didn't just howl down from the peaks, it screamed. It was a raw, hungry sound, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey, and Caleb Rock's cabin was the prey. He was up on the roof, a rope clutched in his frozen hands, trying to lash the groaning beams together. But he knew. He knew he was losing. The snow wasn't soft. It was heavy, wet, and it hit the ground like bags of cement. With every gust, the entire cabin shuddered, the log walls groaning in protest. Caleb's breath was a thick white cloud in the frigid air, each exhale a small defeat. Another night like this, and his home would be splinters. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not the groaning wood, but a sound that shot ice through his veins, a sharp, violent crack, the back corner beam. It was gone. He didn't think. He launched himself off the ladder, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He grabbed his rifle from the porch, snagged his tool bag just as another blast of wind tried to tear it away, and lunged inside. The cabin was a cave, dark, cold, and dying. The fire was nothing but a few sullen embers, and the smell of rot. He looked at his food stores. The sacks of dried venison and cornmeal were soaked through. A leak from the night before. Useless. He cursed. The word swallowed by the storm. Half his supplies were gone. With winter already digging its claws into the valley, he wouldn't last a week. He was a man who had turned his back on the world, a man who found his peace in the silence of the high peaks. But survival doesn't care about peace. He strapped on his worn leather pack, wrapping his furs tight around his shoulders. He tossed the few pelts he had left into his bag. He'd need to trade them: flour, coffee, nails. But a cold, hard truth gnawed at him. Even if he fixed the roof, he didn't have enough food to survive the winter. The mountain was kicking him out. As a weak dawn broke through the gray sky, he saddled his horse, Buck. He guided the chestnut down a trail that was more of a scar between the snow-laden pines. For 2 years, this mountain had been his shield, his fortress against the questions and the pity of the world below. Now, it felt like a prison collapsing in on him. But as he descended, something caught his eye. Something that shouldn't be there. He reined Buck to a halt, his eyes narrowing. He slid off the horse, his boots crunching in the snow, and knelt. There, near the base of a massive pine, was a footprint. Not his, and it was fresh. Then another, and another. 2 men. They had come up the trail, and then veered off toward the back of his cabin, toward the beam that had cracked. Caleb's blood ran cold. He stood up slowly, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. He scanned the trees, the snow, the silent landscape. The wind howled. But it wasn't the wind that had broken his home. It was something else, someone else. The storm had been the perfect cover. This wasn't bad luck. This was an attack. And Caleb had no idea why. He mounted Buck again, his mind racing. Who would want him gone? He was a nobody, a ghost who lived in the clouds. He kept to himself, traded his furs once a season, and spoke to no one. It made no sense. As he rode lower, the trail grew more treacherous, a sheet of ice hiding beneath the fresh powder. Below, through a break in the trees, he saw it. A curl of smoke rising from a chimney. A ranch. He'd passed it once, a lifetime ago last summer. A widow's place, the town gossip had whispered. Stubborn woman refused to sell after her husband died. He hadn't cared then. But now anyone down here was a question mark. A possible enemy. He guided Buck closer, moving through the trees like a shadow. And then he saw her. A woman on a shaky ladder, her back to him. She was trying to nail a plank to a sagging barn roof, the wind whipping her faded gray coat around her. She reached for a nail, but her cold fingers fumbled. The nails scattered, disappearing into the snow. A soft curse floated on the wind, and then she froze. She had seen him. Caleb urged Buck forward, raising a gloved hand. He knew how he must look. A wild man, bearded and wrapped in furs, a rifle on his back, appearing out of a snowstorm. "Morning!" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. That roof looks like it's about to give up the ghost. She climbed down the ladder with a surprising grace, dusting snow from a worn skirt. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 27. Dark hair was tucked into a wool cap, and her face was pale, but her eyes were a clear, sharp gray, and they held no fear, only challenge. "And who are you?" she asked, her voice steady. "Riding down from the peaks like you own them." "Name's Caleb Rock," he said, "and I don't own a thing but this horse and this rifle. But I know a failing roof when I see one." Her gaze flickered from him to the barn, then back again. She crossed her arms, studying him. "I suppose you're looking for work." "Wasn't the plan," he said, his voice flat. "But I figure that barn won't survive another storm. You could use a hand." He saw a flicker of hesitation, a flicker of something else, too. Desperation. Finally, she gave a tight nod. "I'm Lydia Mercer, and yes," she said, the words costing her, "I could use a hand. My husband, he passed last spring. It's just been me since." Caleb dismounted. He looked around. The fences were sagging. The pasture gate was barely hanging on. This wasn't just a broken barn. This was a whole life hanging by a thread. He looked at her hands, raw and chapped from the cold and the work. "Got tools?" he asked. "Some. Not much lumber." "I can start with what you've got," he said. But as he spoke, his eyes scanned the ground around the barn. And that's when he saw it. Tucked away near the foundation, almost completely covered by snow, was a small, dark object. He ambled over, pretending to inspect the foundation, and nudged it with his boot. It was a pair of wire cutters, heavy duty, the kind you'd use to cut through thick fencing wire, not the kind of tool you'd misplace. He glanced at the fence line. In the distance he could see a section that was clearly broken, but from here he could tell. It wasn't broken. It was cut. He looked back at Lydia. She was watching him, her expression guarded. She had no idea. Or did she? "We'll sort out payment later," he said, his voice lower now, more intense. "Right now, let's just keep this barn from falling on your cattle." He picked up the hammer she'd dropped. It felt solid in his hand. He looked from the broken barn to the cut fence, and then up toward the mountain where his own sabotaged cabin stood. This wasn't a coincidence. The storm that had driven him down the mountain wasn't just weather. It was a part of something bigger, something dark and dangerous. And he had just walked right into the middle of it. The work was hard and cold. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the heat from their bodies and the feeling from their fingers. Caleb moved with a grim efficiency, his mind 1,000 miles away from the planks and nails. He was replaying the scene at his cabin, the footprints, the snapped beam. It wasn't an amateur job. Whoever did it knew how to bring a structure down with minimal effort. Lydia worked beside him, hauling wood, her silence as thick as the gray sky. She never complained, she just worked, her jaw set, her eyes focused. He found himself watching her. She wasn't just stubborn, she was resilient, forged from the same hard land they stood on. By midday, they had secured the worst of the damage. The barn still looked wounded, but it would stand. They took a break on the porch, the cold seeping through their coats. "You live here all alone?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I do," she said. "Everyone in town has an opinion. Sell the land to Silas Hardwell, marry again, move to town and be a seamstress." She said the name Silas Hardwell with a particular distaste. "But this land, this was everything to my husband, Thomas. It's all I have left of him." Caleb nodded slowly. "People always think they know best." Lydia looked at him, her gray eyes searching his face. "And you? What brings a mountain man down into the valley? Not just a leaky roof, I'm guessing." He tensed. The image of the footprints flashed in his mind, the feeling of being targeted, hunted. He wasn't ready to share that, not with a stranger, not when he didn't know who was on what side. "Cabin needs more than a patch job," he said, the lie tasting like ash. "Needed supplies. Figured I'd trade labor for them." It was a weak answer and he knew it. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see through the walls he'd built around himself. Then, her expression softened slightly. "You're welcome to stay the night, in the barn loft. It's a long ride to town, and those clouds look like they're planning a second round." He was about to refuse, to keep moving, but he looked at the sky. She was right. The clouds were gathering again, darker this time, and then he thought of the wire cutters, of the cut fence. Leaving her alone tonight felt wrong. It felt like abandoning a soldier on the battlefield. "All right," he said, "thank you." As dusk bled across the snow, painting the valley in shades of purple and gray, Caleb did one last check on the barn. While Lydia was inside, he walked the perimeter of the property. He found the break in the fence. The wire was cut clean. No doubt about it. This was sabotage. The same kind of sabotage that had wrecked his cabin. He knelt in the snow, examining the ground. More prints. Same 2 sets of boots from his mountain. They had been here. On her land. Why? The question pounded in his head. What was the connection between a recluse on a mountain and a widow on a ranch? The only common thread was Silas Hardwell, the man who wanted her land. But why would Hardwell care about him? Why drive him off his mountain? He walked back to the barn, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion. He climbed the ladder to the loft. It was dry and smelled of hay and leather. He unrolled his bedroll, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. He sat by the small loft window, his rifle across his lap, and watched the house. The light in Lydia's kitchen cast a single warm yellow square against the encroaching darkness. He watched her move inside, a silhouette of lonely strength, and he felt a cold dread creep into his gut. Silas Hardwell didn't just want her land. He was playing a bigger, more dangerous game, and for some reason, that game involved getting Caleb Rock off that mountain and down into this valley. It was a trap. He had been herded, like one of Lydia's own cattle, right where someone wanted him. He looked from the warm light of her kitchen to the dark, menacing tree line. He wasn't just here to fix a barn. He was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. And he had a terrifying feeling that Lydia Mercer was the prize. The night was long and restless. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every creak of the old barn a threat. Caleb didn't sleep. He watched. He listened. He felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, and the picture they were forming was ugly. Silas Hardwell wants the ranch. He tries to intimidate Lydia. It doesn't work. So he escalates. He cuts her fences. Still, she doesn't break. So he needs a new plan, a new lever. Me. Somehow Hardwell knew the storm would be bad enough to damage Caleb's cabin. But he didn't leave it to chance. He sent his men up the mountain to make sure the cabin would fail, to force Caleb down into the valley, homeless and desperate for work. A man like that, a rough mountain drifter, showing up at a lone widow's ranch. It would start talk. It would make her look vulnerable, maybe even reckless. It would isolate her further. It was a cruel, calculated move. And it had worked perfectly. Morning arrived with a weak gray light. The smell of coffee drifted from the house, a scent of civilization he hadn't experienced in months. When he climbed down the ladder, Lydia was already there, holding out a steaming mug. "You look like you wrestled a bear and lost," she said, her voice quiet. "Something like that," he muttered, taking the mug. The heat was a shock to his frozen hands. They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension of the night before hanging between them. "I'm going into town today," he said, getting straight to the point. "For the nails and planks to fix this barn right, and the wire to mend that fence." He watched her face for a reaction when he mentioned the fence. Her expression tightened. "I saw the tracks yesterday, after you went to the loft. It was cut, wasn't it?" He nodded. "Clean cut." She looked away, toward the silent, snow-covered fields. "He's not going to stop." "No," Caleb agreed. "He's not." She took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring. "Then I have a proposition for you. Don't just go to town for supplies. I want to hire you, to stay." The supplies for the barn seemed laughably insignificant now. They weren't fighting for a ranch. They were fighting for their lives. "What is it?" Lydia asked, her voice shaking. "What's on my land that's worth all this?" "I don't know," Caleb said, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "But we're going to find out." He looked out at the vast, snow-covered darkness that surrounded them. It wasn't just a landscape anymore, it was a battlefield. And the war had just begun. They worked under a sliver of moon, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fear. The simple act of mending a fence had transformed into fortifying a stronghold. Every nail Caleb hammered was a small act of defiance. Every strand of wire Lydia stretched tight was a refusal to surrender. "He won't come at us directly," Caleb said, his breath pluming in the icy air. "Not yet. He thinks he's smarter than that. He'll keep using the law, the town, to squeeze you." "The bank," Lydia said, her voice flat. "They gave me until the end of the season to make the next payment on the loan. Silas mentioned it. He's pressuring them, I know it." "How much do you need?" She named a figure that was impossibly large. A fortune out here. With Thomas gone and selling off half the herd just to pay his burial costs, there's no way I can make it. It was a checkmate. A slow, grinding defeat orchestrated by a man who held all the cards. "There has to be another way," Caleb muttered, more to himself than to her. He scanned the dark, looming shapes of the mountains that bordered her property. The North Canyon, the place where her husband had died. Thomas, what was he doing up there? "Prospecting," Lydia said, her voice catching. "It was his dream. He was always so sure there was a vein of silver somewhere in those hills. He spent every spare moment up there. He had a small camp, some tools." She trailed off, the memory too painful. "He found it," Caleb said, the certainty of it settling in his bones. "He found the silver, Lydia, and he told someone, or someone saw him." "Silas," she breathed. "Thomas never trusted him. He always said Silas had the devil's own luck, always showing up in the right place at the wrong time. A rock slide. The perfect murder. No witnesses, no evidence, just an accident." "We need to go up there," Caleb said. "To his camp. There might be something. A map, a journal, anything that proves what he found." "It's dangerous," Lydia warned. "The snow is deep, and the path is treacherous even in summer, and if Silas's men are watching—" "They are," Caleb said grimly. "Which is why we'll go when they least expect it, in the heart of the next storm." For the next few days, they existed in a state of heightened alert. They worked on the fences during the day, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. At night, Caleb didn't even bother with the loft. He took up a watch in the house, sitting in a chair by the window, his rifle never leaving his side. Lydia would stay up with him, mending clothes or cleaning a harness, her quiet presence a strange comfort in the tense darkness. They spoke little, but a new bond was being forged between them in the crucible of fear and necessity. He saw a strength in her he'd never witnessed before, a quiet resolve that matched his own. And she, in turn, saw past the rough mountain man to the protector underneath, the wounded soldier who had found a new battle to fight. One evening, while cleaning his rifle by the firelight, he found her watching him. "Why are you doing this, Caleb?" she asked softly. "This isn't your fight. You could have ridden on. No one would have blamed you." He stopped, the rag still in his hand. He looked into the fire, at the dancing flames that always reminded him of the night he lost everything. "A long time ago, I failed to protect my family," he said, his voice low and raw. "I ran from that failure. I hid on a mountain, thinking I could outrun the ghosts, but they followed me." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Hardwell didn't just burn my cabin, Lydia. He brought the ghosts down from the mountain with him. This is my fight now. He made it my fight." He saw tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Thomas used to say that some men are like the mountains themselves. They don't bend, no matter how hard the wind blows. She offered him a small, sad smile. "He would have liked you, Caleb Rock. The storm came 2 nights later. It was a monster, a blizzard that turned the world into a swirling vortex of white. Visibility was zero. The wind shrieked like a banshee. It was the perfect cover. "It's time," Caleb said, pulling on his heaviest furs. "I'm coming with you," Lydia said, already wrapping a scarf around her face. "No, it's too dangerous. I need you here, watching the ranch. It's my land, my husband's memory. I'm coming." There was no arguing with the look in her eyes. He gave a curt nod. They saddled the horses, the wind tearing at them, trying to push them back. They moved out into the blizzard, 2 small figures against the immense raging power of the storm. They were ghosts in a world of ghosts, the driving snow erasing their tracks a second after they were made. The journey to the North Canyon was a nightmare. The wind was a physical force, and the snow was so deep the horses struggled with every step. But Caleb navigated by instinct, his internal compass honed by years in the wilderness. After what felt like an eternity, they found it. Tucked under a rock outcropping, almost completely buried in snow, was the remains of a small campsite. A rusted pickaxe lay half-buried. A canvas sheet, frozen stiff, covered a small stack of supplies. They dug frantically with their gloved hands. Under the canvas, they found a small, locked metal box. "This is it," Lydia breathed, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "He kept his papers in here." Caleb took the butt of his rifle and smashed the rusty lock. It sprang open. Inside, bundled in oilcloth, was a stack of papers, a deed to the ranch, some letters, and underneath it all, a small leather-bound journal. Lydia's hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with her husband's neat, careful script. Daily observations, notes on the weather, sketches of rock formations. She flipped through the pages, her breath catching with every turn. Then she stopped. "Caleb, listen to this." She read from the last entry, dated the day he died. "Found it. After all these years, I've finally found it. The main vein. It's richer than I ever dreamed. I must be careful. SH was sniffing around my claim markers again today. He knows I'm onto something. He has a darkness in him. If anything happens to me, I pray Lydia finds this. The map is safe. He'll never find it. It's hidden in plain sight, in the one place he would never think to look, in the heart of the one I built for my love." Lydia looked up at Caleb, her eyes wide. "A map! He made a map! In the heart of the one I built for my love," Caleb repeated, his mind racing. What had Thomas built for her? Lydia's face suddenly went pale. She looked at Caleb, a dawning horror and understanding in her eyes. "Oh God, Caleb! Not the barn, not the house." Her gaze drifted down to her own hand, to the simple, hand-carved wedding band on her finger. No, it couldn't be. She looked at Caleb, her eyes asking the impossible question. His mind went back to the first day they met, to the tools, to the nails scattered in the snow, to something else he had seen, something he had dismissed. "Lydia," he said slowly, "the day I arrived, in the barn, there was something hidden in the rafters. I thought it was just a trinket." "What was it?" she whispered. "A small carved bird," he said. "A mockingbird." Lydia let out a small, choked sob. "That was his name for me. Mockingbird. Because I was always singing." She looked from the journal to Caleb, her mind reeling. "He built that for me. A little whittled bird. He told me it was our good luck charm. It wasn't a charm, it was a hiding place. The map wasn't on a piece of paper. It was carved somehow, inside that tiny wooden bird, hidden in the rafters of the barn, hidden in plain sight." But as the realization hit them, another, colder thought followed. Silas Hardwell had been in the barn. Caleb remembered the creaking door during the storm, the night Silas had come to threaten them. Hardwell hadn't found the bird, but he knew to look there. How? Then it hit Caleb, the wire cutters. He hadn't just found them outside. He remembered exactly where. Tucked away under the foundation of the barn. Hardwell hadn't been cutting the fence from the outside. He had been inside the ranch boundaries, and that meant one thing. He hadn't been alone. Someone on the ranch had let him in. But there was no one else on the ranch, just him and Lydia. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes locking on Lydia. She was staring at the journal, her face a mask of grief. It was impossible, unthinkable. But the logic was cold and inescapable. The footprints at his cabin, the cut fence, the wire cutters left behind, the attack during the storm, Hardwell knowing about the barn. Someone was feeding Silas Hardwell information. Someone knew their every move. He looked at Lydia, the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman who had fought so bravely beside him, and for the first time, a sliver of ice-cold doubt entered his heart. What if her grief was a performance? What if her defiance was an act? What if the stubborn widow was playing a far more dangerous game than he could ever imagine? The thought was a betrayal, a poison that seeped into the fragile trust they had built. Caleb looked at Lydia, her face illuminated by the faint lantern light in the swirling snow, and he felt a chasm open between them. He was trapped in a blizzard, miles from safety, with a dead man's journal, a secret map, and a woman who was suddenly a complete and terrifying mystery. "We need to get back," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He shoved the journal into his coat. He couldn't look at her. If she was innocent, his suspicion was a terrible cruelty. If she was guilty, he was a dead man. The ride back was a silent, frozen hell. The wind howled, but the silence between them was louder. Every time his horse stumbled, he imagined a bullet in his back. Every time she looked at him, he searched her eyes for a flicker of deceit, a hint of the truth. He saw only grief and fear. But was it real? When they finally staggered into the relative shelter of the barn, they were both covered in snow, half frozen and exhausted. The animals were restless, their low sounds echoing the turmoil in Caleb's own soul. "I'll check on the cattle," Lydia said, her voice trembling from the cold. She slid off her horse and moved toward the stalls, her back to him. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, his mind a war zone. The bird. He had to get the bird. He scrambled up the ladder to the loft, his heart pounding. He had tucked the small carving into a crevice in the beams for safekeeping. His frozen fingers fumbled in the darkness. It was gone. The blood drained from his face. Gone. He scrambled back down the ladder just as Lydia was coming out of the stalls. "The bird is gone," he said, the words like stones in his mouth. She stared at him, her face blank with confusion. "Gone? What do you mean?" "It's not where I put it, Lydia. Someone took it." His eyes bore into hers, silently accusing her. Her expression shifted from confusion to hurt, then to anger. "You think I took it? You think I'm working with him? After everything? After he killed my husband?" "Someone is," Caleb shot back, his voice rising. "Someone let Hardwell onto this ranch. Someone told him to look in the barn. The bird is gone. What else am I supposed to think?" Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "I don't know, Caleb. I don't know. But it wasn't me." A loud bang from outside cut through their argument. It wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle, followed by another. They both froze. Caleb grabbed his rifle and rushed to the barn door, peering through a crack. In the swirling snow he could see them, 3 riders, Silas Hardwell and 2 of his men, their rifles out, firing toward the house. They weren't trying to hit anything. They were making noise, creating a diversion. And then he saw him. A 4th man on foot, slipping away from the back of the house, holding a small object in his hand. The bird. It wasn't Lydia. There was someone else. "Get down!" Caleb yelled, pulling Lydia away from the door as a bullet splintered the wood near her head. He risked another look. The man on foot was disappearing into the blizzard. But Caleb had seen his face. Just for a second. It was a face he recognized. The nervous, twitchy face of Elliot Pewitt, the store owner. It all made sense. The fear in Pewitt's eyes, the way he'd sent signals. He wasn't just an informant. He was an active accomplice. He must have a key, or knew a way in. He must have been the one on the property, the one leaving the cutters, the one who took the bird. Pwit, Caleb breathed. It's the store owner. The shooting outside stopped. The riders were pulling back, their job done. They had the map. They have it, Lydia whispered in horror. They have the map to the silver mine. It's not over yet, Caleb said, his voice a low growl. The doubt and suspicion he'd felt toward Lydia morphed into a white-hot rage directed at Hardwell and his cronies. He had been played. They had been played. Hardwell had used their trip to the canyon, the very act of them discovering the journal, as a distraction to send Pruitt in to steal the map itself. He had been one step ahead of them the entire time. Caleb looked at Lydia. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but the anger was there too, a burning coal of defiance. His doubt had wounded her, he could see that, but the immediate threat had pushed it aside. He thinks he's won, Caleb said, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He has the map. He'll head for the mine as soon as this storm breaks. We can't let him, Lydia said, her voice shaking but firm. That silver was Thomas's legacy. It was meant to be for this ranch, for our future. He won't get it, Caleb promised. He looked from her determined face to the raging blizzard outside. Hardwell had the map, but Caleb had something better. He had the land itself memorized. He had a ranger's training, and he had a reason to fight that went far beyond silver. He thinks the game is over, Caleb said, a cold, dangerous smile touching his lips for the first time. But he just made his first mistake. He showed me his whole hand. The storm raged for another day, trapping them in a world of white. But it was no longer a prison. It was a planning room. The anger and betrayal had been burned away by a cold, shared purpose. The accusation still hung in the air between them, an unhealed wound, but they didn't speak of it. There was no time. He has the map, Caleb said, pacing the small kitchen floor like a caged wolf. But the map only shows the location of the mine entrance. It doesn't show the terrain. It doesn't show the weaknesses of the canyon. Thomas knew them, Lydia said, her voice quiet. He wrote about them in his journal. Loose rock here, a narrow passage there. He marked the dangerous spots. She had the journal open on the table, scanning the pages her husband had written. Caleb stopped pacing. Tell me. For hours, she read to him. She described the treacherous paths, the overhangs prone to collapse, the hidden crevices. He listened, his eyes closed, building a three-dimensional map in his mind. He wasn't just learning the layout of the canyon. He was learning how to use it as a weapon. Hardwell will be arrogant, Caleb reasoned. He thinks he's won. He'll be fast, but he'll be careless. He and his men, Pruitt included, they'll ride straight for the entrance. There's only one main path that's wide enough for horses in this snow, Lydia added, tracing a line on the table with her finger. The winter trail. It runs along the base of the eastern ridge. And right below the Widow's Peak, Caleb finished, a grim look on his face. Thomas mentioned it in the journal, an unstable rock formation that looks like a shrouded figure. He said to always pass it quickly, Lydia whispered. He said a loud noise could bring the whole thing down. A plan began to form in Caleb's mind, a dangerous, desperate plan. It wasn't about fighting them head-on. It was about using their own greed and the mountain itself against them. As the storm began to subside, a tense quiet fell over the ranch. It was the calm before the battle. Caleb gathered his gear, ropes, a pickaxe, and several sticks of dynamite he had kept from his prospecting days, tucked away in his saddlebag. Lydia watched him, her face pale. Dynamite? A loud noise, he said simply. She didn't argue. She simply went to the cupboard and began packing a small satchel with food and a flask of hot coffee. If you're going, I'm going with you. Lydia, no. This is not a discussion, Caleb, she said, her gray eyes flashing with steel. I know the canyon as well as you do now. I am not a woman who waits by the fire. I am the woman who rides into the storm. You taught me that. He looked at her, at the fierce, unbreakable spirit that Silas Hardwell had so badly underestimated. He saw not a victim, but a warrior. He gave a single, sharp nod. They left before dawn, under the cover of a pre-dawn darkness, the snow now a deep, pristine blanket over the valley. They didn't take the main trail. Caleb led them on a high, hidden path, a goat trail that Thomas had sketched in the margins of his journal. It was harder, steeper, but it would keep them hidden. From a high ridge they saw them, 4 riders moving through the canyon below, Hardwell in the lead, Pewitt nervously holding the wooden bird, and 2 hard-faced men with rifles at the ready. They were moving quickly, just as Caleb had predicted, their eyes fixed on the goal. Caleb and Lydia dismounted, tethering their horses in a thicket of pines. They continued on foot, moving like shadows along the ridge that overlooked the winter trail. The air was thin and bitingly cold. Below them, Hardwell's party was approaching the narrowest part of the canyon, directly beneath Widow's Peak. Caleb opened his satchel. He worked quickly, his fingers sure despite the cold. He set the primer on a stick of dynamite, cut a length of fuse, and checked it twice. "When I light this," he said to Lydia, his voice low and intense, "you need to get back to the horses. Fast, don't wait for me." "Caleb." "That's an order, Lydia." His eyes were hard, but underneath she saw a flicker of something else, a desperate plea. She nodded, her throat tight. He peered over the edge. Hardwell and his men were almost directly below. Their voices, arrogant and triumphant, floated up on the cold air. "Should be just around this bend, boss," Pewitt called out, his voice shrill with excitement. "That silver is as good as ours," Hardwell laughed. "And the ranch will follow. The bank will foreclose by the end of the week." It was time. Caleb lit the fuse. It sputtered to life, a tiny, angry spark in the vast white wilderness. "Go!" he hissed to Lydia. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes locked on his. Then she turned and ran, scrambling back toward the horses. Caleb held the dynamite, counting the seconds. He waited until Hardwell's group was in the very center of the pass. Then, with a prayer on his lips, he tossed the dynamite. It arced through the air, a dark speck against the white snow, and landed on a ledge just above the trail. He didn't wait to watch. He turned and sprinted, following Lydia's path, diving behind a cluster of boulders just as the world exploded. The sound was immense, a deafening roar that echoed through the canyon, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. It was followed by a deeper, grinding groan. The sound of rock giving way. He risked a look. Widow's Peak was moving. Tons of rock and snow, loosened by the blast, were shearing off the side of the mountain. An avalanche. Not a massive one, but big enough to seal the canyon. He saw the momentary panic on the faces of the men below. They tried to turn their horses, but it was too late. The wall of snow and rock hit the trail with the force of a tidal wave. It didn't bury them. It blocked them. The path ahead was gone, obliterated under a mountain of debris. The path behind was now a sheer drop where the trail had crumbled away. They were trapped. Hardwell, Pewitt, and his 2 thugs, stranded on a narrow ledge with no way forward and no way back. Caleb felt a grim satisfaction. The first part of his plan had worked, but it wasn't over. He had trapped the wolves. Now he had to face them. He found Lydia by the horses, her face ashen. "Are they—" "Trapped," Caleb said, "but alive." He pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "Now comes the hard part." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Hardwell doesn't get to be buried by a mountain," Caleb said, his eyes like chips of flint. "He gets to face justice, and I'm going to be the one who delivers it." He looked at her. "I need you to do something for me. The most important thing, ride to town, not to Miller, find Judge Peterson. He's an old man, but he's honorable. Tell him what happened. Tell him Hardwell murdered your husband. Tell him Hardwell tried to kill us. Bring him here. But Lydia—" He grabbed her arm, his grip urgent. "Do not come back here alone. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also with trust. The doubt between them was gone, buried under the avalanche. "Be careful, Caleb," she whispered. "Always," he said. He watched her mount her horse, and ride away, a lone figure on a desperate mission. Then he turned his attention back to the canyon. He slid down a steep, snow-filled gully, his boots sinking deep, until he was on the same level as the trapped men, but 100 yards away, hidden by a maze of boulders. He could hear their panicked shouts. "There's no way out!" one of the men yelled. "Shut up!" Hardwell barked. "There has to be a way! Start looking!" Caleb smiled a cold, mirthless smile. Let them look. He knew this canyon now. He knew every shadow, every hiding place. They were trapped in his world. He raised his rifle, took aim at a rock just above Hardwell's head, and fired. The bullet ricocheted, sending stone chips flying. The shouting stopped. A terrified silence fell over the canyon. "Hardwell!" Caleb's voice boomed, echoing off the rock walls. "You wanted a war. You've got one." The game had changed. It wasn't about silver anymore. It was about survival. And in this frozen, broken canyon, Caleb Rock was the king. The canyon became a maze of rock and fear. Caleb was a ghost, a whisper of vengeance that haunted the trapped men. He used the terrain, his knowledge from Thomas's journal, to torment them. A shot fired from an unseen perch. A rock sent tumbling down a slope to make them jump. He never tried to kill them. He was hurting them, wearing them down, letting the cold and the terror do his work for him. "He's toying with us!" one of Hardwell's men screamed after hours of the relentless psychological assault. "Find him!" Hardwell roared, his voice raw with fury and a growing panic. "Find him and kill him!" But they couldn't find what they couldn't see. Caleb moved through the rocks like a mountain lion, silent and deadly. He was in his element. They were city predators, lost in a true wilderness. Their weakest link was Pewitt. The store owner was not a gunman or a thug. He was a coward, driven by greed, and he was breaking fast. Caleb focused on him. He whispered his name from the rocks, letting the wind carry it. "Elliot! The silver won't keep you warm when you freeze to death, Elliot." By nightfall, the trapped men were huddled together on the ledge, their bravado gone, replaced by a shivering dread. Their fire was small, a pathetic beacon in the immense cold. Caleb watched them from above. He had them right where he wanted them. Now, he just had to wait for Lydia. He prayed she had made it. He prayed she had found the judge. Inside the circle of firelight, the alliance was crumbling. "This is your fault, Silas," Pewitt shrieked, his face streaked with frozen tears. "You said he was just some dumb mountain man. You said it would be easy." "Shut your mouth, you sniveling worm," Hardwell snarled, but his own voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing into the darkness, his hand never far from his pistol. "I want out!" Pewitt cried. "I'll tell him everything! I'll tell him you killed Mercer!" That was it. The confession. Hardwell moved like a snake. He drew his pistol and backhanded Pewitt across the face with the barrel. The store owner went down with a cry. "There are no deals," Hardwell hissed, standing over him. "We get out of this, or we die here, all of us." The two thugs looked at each other, their loyalty to Hardwell clearly wavering. They were trapped on a ledge with a man who was unraveling, being hunted by a ghost they couldn't see. Caleb knew it was time to make his final move. He couldn't wait for the judge. He had to end this now, before they turned on each other, and he lost his chance to bring Hardwell in alive. He circled around, using a hidden path from the journal, and came up behind their small camp. He was 20 feet away, shrouded in the deep shadows just beyond the firelight, when he spoke. "It's over, Hardwell." The four men spun around, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. Caleb stepped into the light, his rifle leveled at Hardwell's chest. "You're not going to shoot me," Hardwell sneered, trying to regain his composure. "You need me to get out of here. You'll freeze just like us." "I was born in the cold, Silas," Caleb said, his voice flat. "I'm not afraid of it." He looked at the two thugs. "He lied to you. There is no silver. He was never going to share it, just like he was never going to share it with Thomas Mercer before he murdered him." "Lies!" Hardwell shouted. "Was it a lie, Pewitt?" Caleb asked, his gaze shifting to the whimpering store owner. "Tell them what you told me. Tell them how Silas paid you to get information from Thomas. Tell them how he promised you a share after he arranged that rock slide." Pewitt was sobbing now. "He made me. He said he'd ruin me." The two thugs looked at Hardwell, their expressions hardening. They had been played. "Drop your weapons," Caleb commanded. "Both of you, slide them over. You walk out of here and take your chances with the judge, or you die here with him. Your choice." The thugs hesitated for a second, then their eyes met. They dropped their rifles and kicked them across the snow. Hardwell was alone. His face was a mask of pure hatred. "You," he spat at Caleb. "You should have stayed on your mountain. You should have stayed dead." And then he lunged, not at Caleb, but at Pewitt. He grabbed the smaller man, using him as a human shield, and fired his pistol wildly into the darkness. Caleb dove for cover as bullets pinged off the rocks around him. Hardwell, dragging the screaming Pewitt, scrambled for the edge of the ledge. There was a small, almost invisible fissure in the rock face, a cave entrance Thomas had marked in his journal as unstable. Hardwell shoved Pewitt away and disappeared into the blackness of the cave. Caleb was on his feet in an instant. He checked on Pewitt. The man was terrified, but unharmed, and then turned to the cave. "Stay here," he ordered the two thugs. "Don't even think about moving." He grabbed a burning brand from the fire for a makeshift torch and plunged into the cave after Hardwell. The tunnel was narrow and smelled of damp earth and decay. The torchlight flickered, casting monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls. He could hear Hardwell up ahead, scrambling over loose rock, cursing. The tunnel opened into a larger cavern. In the center was a deep, black pit, an old mine shaft that dropped into nothingness. Hardwell was on the far side, his back to the wall, his pistol aimed at the entrance. "One more step, Rock, and I'll kill you," he snarled. "You've lost, Silas," Caleb said, holding the torch high. "Your men have given up. Lydia is on her way back with the judge. It's over." "It's not over until I'm dead," Hardwell yelled, his voice echoing crazily in the cavern. "And I'm taking you with me." He fired. The shot went wide, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The vibration shook the cavern. A shower of dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Caleb saw his chance. He wasn't a killer. He was a lawman. He needed a confession. "Is this how you killed Thomas Mercer?" Caleb shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "Did he beg for his life like Pewitt did?" "Mercer was a fool," Hardwell screamed, his composure finally shattering. "He found the mother lode, and he wanted to report it, register the claim. I offered him a partnership. He refused. So I buried him. Just like I'll bury you." The confession, clear and loud. "And my family?" Caleb's voice dropped, becoming deadly soft. "The man who burned my home, was he one of yours too?" Hardwell laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Barker? That drunken idiot? He worked for me on and off. I heard he had a grudge against some ranger. I told him where to find you. I paid him. I wanted your land too. It was a shortcut to the canyon. I burn what I can't have, Rock. I always have." The world went red for Caleb. Every ounce of his control, every lawman's code evaporated. This man was the architect of all his pain. He had taken everything. But before he could act, a voice came from the cave entrance behind him. "Drop the gun, Mr. Hardwell." Caleb spun around. It was Lydia, and behind her, a stout, white-haired man holding a shotgun. "Judge Peterson." Hardwell stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He was cornered, beaten. His eyes darted from the judge to Lydia to Caleb, and then a final, insane smirk twisted his lips. "If I'm going to hell," he hissed, "I'm taking the silver with me." He turned and fired his last bullet, not at them, at the cavern's ceiling right above the old mine shaft. The rock groaned, shuddered, and then collapsed. The entire floor of the cavern gave way, plunging into the blackness of the shaft below. Silas Hardwell disappeared into the abyss, his own greed literally swallowing him whole. A cloud of dust and the thunder of falling rock was all that was left. Silence. Caleb stood there, breathing heavily, the torchlight flickering in his hand. He looked at Lydia. Her face was streaked with dirt, her eyes wide, but she was safe. She was here. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight, the warmth of her, the reality of her, chasing away the ghosts of the cavern. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." Judge Peterson stepped forward, his shotgun held loosely in his hands. He looked at the collapsed mine, then at Caleb and Lydia. He nodded slowly at the two thugs Caleb had left outside, who were now being held at gunpoint by another man who had come with the judge. "I heard the confession, son," the judge said to Caleb, his voice gravelly but kind. "Heard it all. You did good work here today." He looked at the abyss where Hardwell had vanished. Some might call that divine justice. The winter snows began to melt, chased away by a persistent spring sun. The valley came back to life, the brown earth emerging from beneath the white blanket. On Lydia Mercer's ranch, now truly her ranch, life was returning too. With Hardwell gone and his conspiracy exposed, the town of Cottonwood underwent a quiet revolution. Sheriff Miller was run out of town in disgrace. Elliot Pewitt, in exchange for his full testimony, was given a lighter sentence. The fear that Silas had cultivated for so long evaporated, replaced by a sense of communal relief. The bank, under pressure from Judge Peterson, renegotiated Lydia's loan, giving her all the time she needed. The silver mine, once a source of death and greed, was officially signed over to her, its riches promising a future she and Thomas had only dreamed of. Caleb stayed. He didn't return to his mountain. His ghosts had been laid to rest in the dark belly of that cavern. He worked alongside Lydia, but they weren't just fixing fences anymore. They were building a life. The quiet companionship they had forged in the face of danger slowly, naturally, blossomed into something deeper. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they stood on the porch, looking out at the land that had cost them so much and given them so much more. "Thomas would be happy," Lydia said softly, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder. "He always wanted this land to be a place of peace, of new beginnings." Caleb wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. He looked at the sturdy barn, the strong fences, the house that now felt like a home. He had come down from the mountain a broken man, a ghost running from his past, and here, in this valley, with this woman, he had found his resurrection. "We did it, Lydia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We held on." She turned to him, her gray eyes shining. "No, Caleb," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "You held on. You taught me how." He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that held all the promises of the spring, of the future, of a life rebuilt from the ashes. It wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning. They stood there for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear, dark sky. Two survivors who had found their way home. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, and believe that even in the coldest winter, the strength of the human spirit can build something that lasts, then don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of survival and courage. Men in dusty coats and worn hats stopped their conversations to watch him. He was a curiosity, a mountain man, but he could feel it was more than that. News traveled fast here. They already knew who he was. They knew where he was staying. He pushed open the door to the store. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee beans, cured leather, and sawdust. A man behind the counter, small and balding with a nervous twitch in his eye, looked up. This must be Elliot Pewitt, the store owner. "Help you?" Pewitt asked, his eyes darting from Caleb's face to the furs slung over his shoulder. "Got some pelts to trade," Caleb said, his voice low and even. He dropped the furs on the counter, then he handed over Lydia's list. Pewitt's eyes scanned the list, and his face paled slightly when he saw the sheer quantity of nails and wire. He looked up at Caleb, his expression a mixture of fear and pity. This is for the Mercer place, ain't it?" he whispered. Caleb just stared at him. Pewitt swallowed hard. "Folks are talking, mister. Silas Hardwell. He's been telling everyone he's about to close a deal on that ranch, that the widow's finally seen reason." "She hasn't," Caleb said, his voice flat. Just then, the door creaked open again. A wave of cold air washed in, and with it, the man himself. Silas Hardwell. He was exactly as Caleb had pictured him, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a fine black coat that was out of place in the rustic store. He had a handsome face, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, like a frozen lake. "Well, well," Hardwell drawled, his voice smooth and confident. He let his gaze drift over Caleb, dismissing him, before settling on the store owner. "Elliot, I need a box of those expensive cigars you keep for me." Then he turned back to Caleb, as if noticing him for the first time. "You must be the stray she took in. Heard a mountain man was fixing her barn. Didn't realize she was so desperate." Caleb didn't rise to the bait. He stood his ground, silent, letting Hardwell talk. "You're wasting your time, friend," Hardwell continued, leaning against the counter, an inch too close. "That ranch is mine. The bank agrees with me. The sheriff agrees with me. Sooner or later, Lydia will too. You're just delaying the inevitable, and probably giving the poor woman false hope." He picked up one of Caleb's furs, rubbing the pelt between his thumb and forefinger. Nice work, but not enough to save her. He dropped it back on the counter. "I'm just a man doing a job," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is that all you are?" Hardwell's eyes glinted. "I hear things, mountain man. I hear about a man who lived up on the peaks, a man who didn't want to be found, a man with a fiery past." Caleb's blood went cold. How could he know? The fire. No one knew the details of that night. No one was left to know. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, Rock?" Hardwell smirked. "But then you don't really have a home anymore, do you?" The threat was clear. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. Hardwell had dug into his past. He knew Caleb's weak spot, and he had just pressed on it, hard. This was a message. "I can destroy you. I already have, once before." Was it possible? Could Hardwell's reach extend that far? Could he have been connected to the fire that took everything from Caleb 2 years ago? The thought was insane, monstrous. But as he looked into Hardwell's cold, dead eyes, a terrifying possibility began to bloom. Before Caleb could respond, the store door opened again. It was the sheriff, a big man with a florid face and a lazy gut that spilled over his gun belt. Sheriff Miller. "Silas," Miller said, with a familiar nod. He glanced at Caleb, his eyes lingering for a moment too long. "Everything all right in here?" "Just having a chat with our town's newest resident," Hardwell said smoothly. "He's been helping out the widow Mercer." "Is that so?" Miller's gaze was hard. "She came by my office this morning, whining about a cut fence, wasting my time with nonsense." He looked directly at Caleb. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Stirring up trouble to make yourself seem useful?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. They were working together. The store owner, the sheriff, Hardwell. Through the winter, at least. "Help me get the fences rebuilt, the barn solid. Help me keep this place standing." He studied her. Her eyes were pleading, but her voice was strong. She wasn't asking for a savior. She was asking for an ally. "You're offering me a job?" he asked, though he knew it was more than that. "I'm offering you a partnership," she corrected. "A share of whatever profit the herd brings in the spring. It's not much, but it's honest work. And," she hesitated, "I think I need someone Silas Hardwell won't be able to scare off." It was the perfect trap. If he said no, he was abandoning her to a predator. If he said yes, he was playing right into Hardwell's hands, becoming the very thing the man wanted him to be. The suspicious drifter, shacked up with the widow. But looking at her, at the quiet fire in her eyes, he knew he didn't have a choice. He was already involved. His own home had been destroyed to make it happen. Running now wouldn't change a thing. "Why me?" he asked, his voice low. "You don't know a thing about me." "I know you see things," she said simply. "You saw the broken roof, the cut fence. You know what's happening here without me having to say a word, and you don't look at me with pity. You look at me like Like you understand what it means to fight for something. A memory flickered in his mind, hot and sharp. A fire, a woman's scream, his own helpless rage. He pushed it down. "All right," he said, the word feeling heavier than any log he'd ever lifted. "I'll stay. But we're not just fixing fences, Lydia. We're preparing for a war." A flicker of relief crossed her face, so profound it was almost painful to see. "Thank you, Caleb." Before she could say more, he walked over to the barn wall, where he'd leaned the wire cutters he'd found. He picked them up. "These yours?" She stared at them, her brow furrowed. "No, I've never seen them before." "I found them near the foundation," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Someone left them behind." Her face went pale as the implication hit her. It wasn't just a random act of vandalism. The culprit had been right here, just feet from her door. "While you're in town," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I want you to do something for me. Don't just go to the bank. Go to the sheriff, Sheriff Miller. Report the cut fence. Report these." He held up the cutters. He wanted to see what would happen. He needed to know if the law in this town was a shield or another one of Hardwell's weapons. Lydia swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the menacing tool in his hand. "Miller. He and Silas Hardwell. They hunt together sometimes. They're friends." Caleb's jaw tightened. Of course they were. "Then don't tell him you found them," he said, changing tactics. "Just report the fence. See how he reacts. See if he even bothers to write it down. See if he asks about Silas Hardwell." It was a test of the town, the law, and the man who was supposed to uphold it. "Be careful, Lydia," he said, and the words felt inadequate. "You too," she whispered. "Silas practically owns the general store. He'll know you're buying supplies for me the second you walk through the door." He gave a grim nod. "Let him." As he saddled Buck, Lydia handed him a list. Nails, planks, wire. At the bottom, she had written 2 words, sugar and salt, underlined. It was a small, defiant act of normalcy in a world that was anything but. It was a declaration that she was still planning for the future, still baking, still living. He tucked the list into his coat. As he rode out, he glanced back. Lydia stood on the porch, a lone figure against the vast, cold landscape. She wasn't watching him leave. She was staring at the wire cutters he'd left on the porch rail, her expression a mixture of fear and hardening resolve. The game had begun, and they had both just made their first move. The ride to Cottonwood was a ride through enemy territory. Caleb felt eyes on him from the trees, from the ridges. Maybe it was just the paranoia of a hunted man, but he didn't think so. Hardwell's reach felt long. The town itself was a single muddy street, lined with false-fronted buildings, huddled together against the cold. As he tied Buck to the hitching post outside the general store, the usual chatter on the boardwalk died down. The whole town was a web, and he and Lydia were caught in the middle. Pewitt, the store owner, wouldn't even meet his eye. He was busy, fussing with a sack of flour, his hands trembling. Caleb had his answer. The law wasn't a shield. It was a club, and it was about to be used against them. "Just get my supplies," Caleb said to Pewitt, his voice like ice. He turned his back on Hardwell and the sheriff, a deliberate act of defiance. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from Hardwell. He had walked into the lion's den, but the lions didn't know one thing. He wasn't a sheep. He was a wolf who had been trying to forget his own teeth, and Silas Hardwell had just reminded him how to bite. As he gathered the heavy sacks and coils of wire, he knew this wasn't about a ranch anymore. This was about vengeance. For Lydia, and maybe, just maybe, for a wife and son buried under the ashes of a home he couldn't protect. He loaded Buck, the weight of the supplies mirroring the weight in his soul. The ride back wasn't just a journey through enemy territory. It was a retreat to the only fortress he had left, Lydia's ranch, and Lydia herself. When he arrived, the sun was already bleeding out behind the peaks. Lydia was waiting on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself. He could see the question in her eyes before she even asked it. "How was it?" she asked, her voice thin. "The sheriff is Hardwell's man," he said, swinging down from the saddle. He didn't soften the blow. She needed to know the truth. All of it. Her shoulders slumped, but only for a second. Then she straightened them again. "I figured as much. Miller practically laughed me out of his office. He said I was probably imagining things. That grief was making me fanciful." "He knows," Caleb said, his voice grim. "They all know. Hardwell, the sheriff, even the store owner, they're all in on it." He paused, looking at her, at the way the fading light caught the fierce resolve in her face. "And it's worse than we thought, Lydia. Hardwell, he knows about me. He knows about my past." He saw confusion in her eyes. "Your past? What about it?" 2 years ago, he said, the words tasting like poison. "My cabin, my wife, my son, they died in a fire." He saw her flinch, a wave of sympathy washing over her face. "I told you that, but I didn't tell you everything. It wasn't an accident. It was arson. Set by a man I was hunting. I was a Texas Ranger, Lydia. I tracked him for months. I got too close, and he came for my family instead. I wasn't there to stop him." The confession hung in the cold air between them. It was a story of failure, of a wound so deep it had sent him fleeing from the world. "Hardwell knows this," Caleb continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He threw it in my face today. He talked about my fiery past. There's no way he could know those details, Lydia. No one knew. Unless—" He didn't have to finish the sentence. She did it for him, her voice trembling. "Unless he was connected to it," she breathed, her eyes wide with horror. "To the man who—" "It sounds crazy," Caleb said, shaking his head, trying to deny the monstrous thought. "But why else would he want me off that mountain so badly? Why go to the trouble of sabotaging my cabin to force me down here?" Suddenly, all the pieces clicked together into a terrifying mosaic. Silas Hardwell wasn't just a greedy rancher. He was something far more dangerous. He wasn't just trying to drive Lydia off her land. He was tying up a loose end. A very old, very personal loose end. "Thomas," Lydia whispered, her face ashen. "My husband. He died in a rock slide up in the North Canyon. Miller ruled it an accident. But Thomas was a careful man, Caleb. He knew those canyons better than anyone. A rock slide, a fire, a cut fence, a sabotaged cabin. They weren't separate events. They were a pattern, a signature." "He's not after your land for the grazing, Lydia," Caleb said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "There's something on this land, something your husband must have found, something worth killing for." They stood there on the porch, the winter darkness closing in around them, the world shrinking until it was just the two of them against a conspiracy that was deeper and deadlier than they could have ever imagined.